democratic governance system. And so that's really my second point. For elections to matter, they must be supported more broadly by good governance. The countries need to invest and uphold the rule of law, which protects human rights, as well as the broad array of institutions that provide checks and balances on the use of power. There has to be an open and inclusive public sphere where people can access quality information and engage in the society, in their governance beyond elections. And the institutions must be inclusive so that people can participate equally, including women and young people. And these are the foundations of societies that ensure that credible, inclusive, and peaceful elections can truly make a difference. And my third point is that, and we may come on to this a little bit more, but perhaps as a backdrop, that while people around the world continue to value democracy greatly, democracy must deliver inclusive development. And in a survey covering 80 countries across all regions, the World Values Survey, Stefan, I'm sure, will talk about his data, 81% of people say that living in a democratic country matters a lot to them. But the data also shows that those democratic systems are not meeting people's expectations for a better life. So in summary, as UNDP, while the election year has been important and very important, we've also been trying to broaden the discussion beyond a focus only on those elections to the institutions of governance in society. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And what about you, Alex? What would you pick up?
Thank you, Reza. I think, as you have pointed out, this has been a huge year for election, the super cycle of election, not just a large number of countries, half of the world population voting. And it's important, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but it's important to recognize the context in which this is happening. So 2 points just that I will mention, so the context and the outcome. So the context we're facing, this is a context of democratic backsliding that we have been seeing just over the years, and different data sets confirm this, just in a lot of different things. Just probably, I think 3 are important to mention. So one is a closure of the civic space, so just the space in which just the elections are taking place. Just a closure as well, just of the democratic institutions and the checks and balances, including the integrity of some of the electoral bodies as well. We've seen a decline just in the either trust of the voters or trust in the tribunals in charge of validating elections or in the election processes themselves. There has been a decline just over the years in that. Voter turnout, just IDEA International have shown that just in percentage term has been declining over the years. And a crisis of trust. There are some indicators. The OECD recently published just a report showing that, something that we have known for some time, that trust levels are quite low, just and have been even declining just over the years. So that's the context in which these elections are happening. And and obviously just this context is going to have an influence somehow on the results. So the second one is on the outcomes themselves. So the outcomes, first, elections took place, just in some cases were contested, but in many cases, for the most part, the elections took place just and deliver outcomes. It's unclear what's going to happen with the new administration. It's probably too early to say what's going to happen with the new administration. Some elections happened recently, some elections happened earlier in the year, but still the new administrations haven't taken office yet. So it's still early. But at least in some cases, what we have seen just over the last 2 years, we have seen changes going in different directions, changes in which there are some countries with autocratic tendencies that tend to strengthen the autocratic tendencies, in some others in which there is a rebound, cases like Poland or Brazil, where we have seen some reversals, and countries that are just getting into, that are coming from democratic governance to a more authoritarian governance. Obviously, just there has been some important elections that are going to beyond that influence beyond the national level, that are going to have an influence in the global countries. You mentioned at the beginning some of the largest countries in the world, had elections recently, and some of the countries just with more geopolitical influence as well had recent elections, the US, the European Parliament, just going probably in different directions. And this is something that we will have to wait to see how this is going to shape the geopolitical environment.
Perfect. Thank you, Alejandro. I was hoping for a more contested analysis of events and so on. So, Stefan, what have you picked up as a trend or event for us?
All right, let me participate with and contribute with that then.
Great.
I think I sort of categorize these elections into the good, bad, and ugly, or to paraphrase the old film, but maybe good, ambiguous, and bad. There's some good things in a few countries like Botswana, with the first alternation in power there this year. And let's not forget the elections in Taiwan, or very early in the year, where the pro-mainland China side lost. And then there are also a number of important elections that have, I think, ambiguous outcomes, like the Indian election. Yeah, BJP lost their majority, but we also know that, autocratizing parties and leaders that starts to be pushed against the wall, they might actually get worse and not better. Something similar in South Africa, maybe hoping for that sharing of power will do something about the pervasive corruption and mismanagement, but who knows? Bangladesh is another case in that category I would put. Then there we have the really bad ones. And here I would put the United States. I could talk forever about that, but my prediction is that democracy will not, in the US, will not survive another Trump term. And I think all the advertisement of intent from Trump and his camp about what they're going to do even in the first 100 days is really, really worrisome. We had the recent Georgia election and all the mess that's still unfolding there. As far as I can see, it's going bad. But also in some established democracies, you mentioned France, you could also mention Germany, all those sort of state elections, but where AfD is gaining ground, not only in the east, but now also in the southern portion of the country, in Bavaria and so on. And of course, the elections that are cementing or enforcing authoritarian rule, like Putin's Russia, like in Tunisia, like in Venezuela. So that would be, I think, overall, there seems to me to be many more of the bad ones than the sort of good ones, and also more than the ambiguous ones, unfortunately.
Great. Well, thanks. That was definitely more engaged and points to discuss. Any of you wants to react to what others said, and in particular what Stefan just said now? Or shall I just come up with my own?
I'll just comment that I think our reflections are not so different, actually. All of us said that elections themselves are not what elections are important, they're necessary, but actually it's the broader governance context which is important. We all know that elections can be fixed in very different ways. So actually, I think our reflections were not so different, even though they came at the issue from different angles.
And if I may add, I mean, just as I said, it's probably too early just to say something, but something that we noticed just when analyzing the election data just against the data on rule of law is something, I mean, that may sound obvious, but it's true, which is just that usually the alternation of power happens in countries that have a stronger governance or a stronger rule of law. Usually just in countries in which there is just lower or weakened rule of law, just what we see is just that the same countries stay in power, right? So even, we're not talking necessarily just about the ultimate autocracies, but even just countries that are in the middle, that have weaker governance, usually the same parties tend to remain in power, which is something I mean, again, just obvious, but it is reinforced in the data, and that speaks as well just about the continuation of this authoritarian trend.
Yeah, but also I think I would like to point to, I mean, I think both that, I mean, a number of these bad elections were not necessarily rigged, or that wasn't the problem. The elections were not the problem, but rather sort of
Great.
either or what Sarah brought up with the lack of inclusive development, and that goes hand in hand, I think, often with what Alejandro talked about with a crisis of trust and decreasing voter participation, so that enabling and making it possible for leaders and parties
That's right.
who are populist, nationalist, reactionary, and anti-pluralist, anti-democrats to come into power and subsequently undermine democracy, which is the trend we've seen for the past 20 years in many countries across the world. So
No, yeah, I mean, thanks for the three of you on this. We'll get to the structures and the drivers of this in just a moment. But just recapping, taking stock of what you said on the events of this year themselves. Indeed, I mean, there are some good, some bad, and some ugly, some ups and downs. Someone in the chat referred to wake-up calls, but it kind of seems to me that this year we moved a little bit beyond that, it's in a way democratic backsliding 2.0, because when the first election of Donald Trump could be seen as a surprise, as a wake-up call, as an accident, well, now the second election was even clearer than the first one, because the agenda was extremely clear and people chose it. And we've seen these forces in a way show also resilience. We talk about resilience of democracy, but we're seeing that these anti-democratic forces show also quite a bit of resilience, and we're probably a little bit beyond the wake-up call now in a form of consolidated eclipse of democracy. Would you agree with that?
you're asking me?
For instance?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it is. I mean, 2.0 would mean that it's qualitatively different or reaching some sort of threshold, and after that we fall off the cliff, kind of thing. And I'm not sure, but I am worried, and I share your worry there. I think, I mean, the election of Trump and what Trump has promised to do with within the United States, but also versus the world. And imagining just the demonstration and signaling effect of democracy being derailed in the United States. What if, I mean, they have their sights, as far as I know now, this time, which they didn't have in the last term, on the National Endowment for Democracy and its associated democracy support programs, NDI, IFES, IRI stuff all around the world. And the whole USAID work on support for democracy. So, this can have enormous ramifications on what we will see in the coming years, especially if he continues then to cozy up with Putin and other dictators around the world and want to be best friends with them again. I think you're right that things are going to get a lot worse before it gets better.
Alejandro, Sarah, any comments on this?
Yeah, I think I agree with Stefan. I don't know whether it's qualitatively different. I think the conditions are different. And that's why it may seem worse. I mean, and I think just probably a couple of points. I mean, I agree with what Stefan said about just what this could look like, but a couple of points. So one is the context of the US election, and I think it's important just in general for the context of many of the elections. We're thinking about democracy, rule of law, and so on, and the context in which this happens, and whether this is going to weaken election or weaken democracy. But it's important that there are a variety of factors that people just base their decisions on. So, and those are probably the most important ones. I mean, so even though it's not necessarily that they just welcome autocracy, I think on the contrary, simply that there are a variety of reasons why people decide between candidates. I mean, in the US, for example, just the economy was an important one, or even just what the opposition is presenting, just that may actually just end up just in selecting a candidate. And I think it's important. I think that happens just in a lot of different elections. I mean, the actual contest is quite relevant, and the context in which this is happening is quite relevant. So it may have consequences for democracy, for sure, but it's important to understand the broader context when thinking about just how these trends are evolving, because there are a lot of contributing factors that just the literature has identified that may indeed point at this. The second one is just that in some contexts, particularly thinking about just these constant shifts, is that, I mean, democracies usually, when they have this tendency, tend to weaken, right? So, and that's what I mean, just when just this happens in a different context. So the context just in which the first administration happened is different than the context in which the second administration happened. In terms of not only the actual institutions, norms, just people, just in the government, but also in terms of the shifts of people, the cultural shift, what it's accepted and so on. And that is probably what is more worrisome, just that's really just how the weakening of institutions of democracies happen. Just on one hand, just the norms, the people, the social norms, the informal institutions, what is accepted, just because then it's more difficult. I mean, things become accepted, just things that 8 years ago were unthinkable, now is just common, right? And that's more difficult to reverse over time. And we have seen just even in some cases in which there has been a reverse just of the authoritarian tendencies, it has become just much more difficult to come back to levels just of a few years ago, because it's much harder to build institutions, to build social norms, than to destroy them. So it's some of the things to consider just as we move forward these trends.
So let's precisely discuss this. And incidentally, I want to say again to the audience that you can ask your questions in the chat. I think there's a couple of people who have raised their hand. You cannot intervene, unfortunately, in the discussion, but you can pose your questions in writing in the chat. So we mentioned on several occasions this confrontation between liberal and authoritarian political forces. I would like to discuss that a little further. There is a mainstream view on this that was clearly exposed by Francis Fukuyama a couple of months ago in an article in Foreign Affairs, and a narrative that depicts a great battle between so-called liberal forces in the Western countries with autocrats abroad and populists within, and characterizes this as a battle over the future of democracy. What it tells us is that the future is bright as long as we can resist the temporary appeal of populists and overcome the challenge of autocrats. And Fukuyama wrote before the US election, I quote him, "Democracy in many parts of the world has shown surprising resilience and may even prevail in the United States." Well, that latter part didn't go too well. He also added, democratic backsliding can and has been resisted in many countries that hold elections. It seems to me that this view is quite detached from the realities that VDEM and World Justice Project and many political scientists around the world have been describing for over a decade, namely that democratic backsliding is a broad and widespread phenomenon that has not been resisted in many countries that hold elections. Regressions in the rule of law have certainly been massive during the rule of governments with authoritarian tendencies, such as Donald Trump's or Viktor Orban's or Jair Bolsonaro's, but they have actually also taken place under liberal governments, such as those of France, the UK, as you said, Stefan, more recently, Germany. And when liberal parties have been elected to replace authoritarians, as Joe Biden's administration in the US, as you were pointing, Alejandro, they have not always seemed able. I would also add that they have not seemed so keen to restore strong limitations in the powers of the executive and take bold steps to protect civil liberties. So, Stefan, I'm turning to you here, and I don't mean to say that there are no differences between someone like Donald Trump and someone like Joe Biden. Obviously, there are very important differences. But when it comes to the defense of the idea of democracy, let us imagine we're aliens looking at this from a distant galaxy. We'd probably think there is a consensus among the people governing these countries about lowering the standards of democracy. There might not be a consensus on how fast and how much, but definitely a consensus on the direction. So, Stefan, is the liberal authoritarian distinction as meaningful as we want it to be?
I think it's very, very meaningful. But we should, as I think your question implies, also realize that it is a scale, right, with some endpoints. But from those endpoints, you can also move gradually in one or the other direction. And that's, I think, what we see is happening. And I would say, even in my own country, in Sweden, it is happening, right? We've seen the weakening of rule of law here with the new right-wing government, supported by the Sweden Democrats that have, Sweden Democrats have documented neo-Nazi roots. And clearly anti-liberal ideas on several fronts that they have made plain clear, and said that Viktor Orban's Hungary is a role model, for example. So I think it's going on many places, and that shift of norms that Alejandro brought up, I think, is really important to keep your eyes on. That's where democracy dies, right? And in our time, that is also helped greatly by the new technology in the form of social media that can work as these megaphones for vast amounts of disinformation. Disinformation spread from coming in from abroad, from Putin's Russia and China and so on, but also from within, from I would say anti-liberal or anti-pluralist groups rather than populist groups and parties and leaders. I think research shows that populism is not necessarily in the sense of being sort of for the people and anti-elite and so on. It's not necessarily anti-democratic, but when they are anti-pluralist, then that's become a problem. That is, there is one people, and I know how to interpret the people's will, right? So the disinformation, I think, is one really, for democracy, really dangerous structural long-term problem. When I witnessed for the January 6th Commission in the US, I summarized it and said, okay, bottom line is democracy dies with the lies. Democracy cannot survive in an environment full of disinformation and falseness about what politicians do and don't do, want to do or don't want to do, and so on. So what Alejandro very rightly pointed to with, people are making choices here and they're voting for leaders that they think represent their interests and all that. But when we start to vote on a lie that we believe in, that choice is meaningless. The whole foundation for democracy evaporates. That vertical accountability that is supposed to help produce what the people want and put that into practice disappears. We don't need to hold elections anymore, which, by the way, Trump said you only need to vote for him once and then you don't have to vote again. But so that gradual change of norms that's being helped by all that disinformation, where, as Alejandro talked about, what was completely unthinkable 5-10 years ago is now sort of normal. Right? That is the dangerous, slow-moving process in these countries that eventually makes it possible for leaders and parties to do away with democracy without the large portions of the populations not really noticing.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Let's also turn a little bit towards the our search for structural socioeconomic explanations that you point at in your very first intervention, Sarah. Well, institutional economics has made a strong connection between transitions in and out of democracy and the distribution of economic and political power in society. It's in particular a core theme in the work of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, who shared the Nobel Prize in Economics this year. So, Sarah, how do you see? You talked about inclusive growth and its relation to democracy. How do you see the kind of cause and effect relations between the political developments that we discussed and the socioeconomic trend towards inequality, and the fact that economic structures, but also the legal and political frameworks that govern them, have been increasingly seen as serving the interests of a small minority?
Thank you. It's a very good question, and I think it's good also to broaden the discussion to beyond the sort of focus on the OECD, which we've been having, which is where UNDP doesn't work in OECD or EU countries. But I think there's, and I'm also not sure that it's right to assert sort of frameworks and thinking that are rooted in kind of Western liberal democracies more broadly to what's going on elsewhere in the world. And the question you asked, I think, is very complicated, and I think the data is very complicated. The relationship between inequality, development, and democracy is not something to be tackled in 3 minutes. And there are much greater minds, including on this panel, on that topic than I am. But I do think there are a couple of clear signs in the data that's worth saying. I think it's worth saying that democracy doesn't necessarily deliver development, but governance systems do need to be effective in providing quality public goods and services, health, education, security. And so they must be legitimate, accountable, and inclusive so that decisions are owned and supported by the population. So governance systems need to have that legitimacy and inclusivity to be, over the long term, to be accepted by the population. And I think we touched on this previously, but people don't only want socioeconomic progress. I think there's data that they also want inclusion and agency. And actually, that's a word that doesn't translate well, agency, into other languages. But I think that sense is also really important across a wide range of populations and social norms. It's political efficacy, perhaps, which is even more difficult to translate. And that goes for 1.9 billion young people, which is a growing demographic, many of whom are actually excluded from political systems. So I think we have an issue there that we need to be talking about more than we do. And the other issue that we need to be talking about more than we do when we talk about democracy is around gender equality. Gender equality is at the heart of democracy, and we also see negative trends in many contexts around that. So for me, I think we need to be broadening out this view about what democratic systems and mechanisms look like now and in the future, and then look at how those are related to systems of equality and inclusion. So I think that, for me, is where the heart of the democracy discussion actually needs to go for the bulk of the world. What are the democratic systems we need globally that support inclusion and agency, and affect changes in people's lives? That's shifting the conversation a little bit, but that's where the sort of thing we're thinking about at UNDP.
No, excellent. We'll come back to this. I think you made a number of very important points. Before that, I wanted to also discuss trust that we mentioned earlier on. Alex, you and the World Justice Project have done specific work on this. So I wanted to ask you, how are people experiencing the deterioration in democratic institutions and in the rule of law? And how does that affect their broader trust in the political system?
Yeah, this is an important point, and I think touches just with the issue that Sarah was mentioning about the many contributing factors. So I would put it just in the context that we have been experiencing, and the first one is I would probably put it in three categories, three broad categories. So one is just on the I mean, if we want to think about the effect of all of this on the trust in the political system, I mean, that eventually can just bring different outcomes. I will point at three factors. So one is, let's say, the referees, right? So as we have seen, just the quality of the just electoral integrity just in the different countries has been declining just over the years. Just and as we were saying, not necessarily just the institution, but the confidence as well, or just some voter suppression in some countries, just the trust that people may have on the different institution has declined, which makes it more difficult to operate. And also just in the context of some authoritarian tendencies, just how some of these institutions have been weakened. So that is the context of the actual referees. You see there just factually, or the confidence in their referees has been declining, and that may have an impact as well, just as we look into the future. The second one is something that Stefan was mentioning about, and has to do just really with the environment and the limited competition and accountability. And by limited competition is what we have seen is, on one hand, we have just a closeness of the civic space, I mean, which obviously limits just the competition just that incumbents may have just when facing elections. The use of this information, just increasing use of this information on different parts of the political spectrum, not necessarily only of incumbents, but even just as part of the electoral process. We recently conducted a couple of surveys in the US and in the European Union. And we got very shocking results on the use of this information. Just in the case of the European Union, the majority of people, for example, think that just disinformation or misinformation is used just as part of the political debate. The majority of people think about that. And even in the US, very shocking results that more than 70% of people think just that disinformation has been used as part of the campaigns, which is something that we see. But these are some of the countries in which just we have a strongest democracy. So this is a reality that is shaping really just the competition. And as Stefan was saying, it's very difficult to really understand the proposals just that people are having. And then obviously that has an effect on trust, both on the incumbents and also just on the political opposition. So that is that's important to take into account. The accountability, just obviously just because of all this environment, then that limits accountability. It's very difficult to actually hold just the governments accountable. Just that mechanism of vertical accountability in this context becomes just less effective. So it's something to take into account. And obviously all of this has an effect on how much people trust the systems. Just finally, just this is reflected, I think, in the low trust that people overall has. So the latest results, just both of the OECD survey, just the survey that we conducted in Europe, is just people have, just among all the different institutions, the institution in which people trust the least are usually political parties. Just that's usually at the bottom, which speaks in general about this trend, and national governments. So which, again, I mean, just tell us just a little bit about where we're going, just or how all of these outcomes are affecting just the trust that people may have both in candidates as well as in the political process.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you for the detailed discussion of this. There's one point that Sarah mentioned on which I wanted to discuss a bit further, and that is the relation between democracy and gender equality. And someone in the chat asks us this very good question. how can you discuss the link between the rollback of democracies and the rollback of gender equality and women's rights? Any reflections on this?
Oh, looks like Sarah froze. Are you there? Uh-huh.
No, Sarah is there.
Hi, Sarah.
Oh,
Yeah, go
go
ahead,
ahead,
Sam.
Stefan. No,
No, you first.
Stefan will have the data on this that I don't necessarily have on my fingertips, but I see the two certainly being intrinsically linked in terms of outcomes. People are, and women are excluded from participation in societies by a number of means, and something that we see a lot of at the UNDP in the work that we do in the countries we work in, it's common across many contexts, is gender-based violence, online violence against women in politics, often technologically facilitated. So we do see that as a really damaging trend, that women who are participating in whatever form politically are explicitly targeted by violence, both online and offline, and that is having a chilling effect on women's political participation at all levels, and that can only be damaging for democracy. And we see that across a range of contexts. But we also, and this comes back to the points that Alejandro was talking about, norms. The gender norms index that UNDP and UN Women put together shows that a majority of the world's population thinks that men make better political leaders than women. That is an astonishing figure, even in countries where one wouldn't necessarily expect that to be the case. So yes, there's a backlash and a deliberate violence against women in the political space, but there is also a huge issue around the patriarchal social norms in many places. So that would be my contribution.
Yes, thanks. I think, Stefan, you wanted to add something?
I just say that, I mean, start from the premise, right? Democracy is based on the premise of political equality. And in modern times, that includes both men and women. They have the same weight, one person, one vote, and the same political rights throughout. They are used also in democracies. There are more men in the political system and leaders of political parties and so on. But if you compare democracies to autocracies, women's representation in all respects, include, and not the least for more important roles, ministerial appointments and so on, and real influence, I mean, is much, much greater. And countries that democratize, typically women's rights also in society and norms sort of change and improve. There's also now a clear trend in the last 20, 30 years with the wave of autocratization, the word I prefer to democratic backsliding, because it's a lot of autocracies backsliding as well. It's also very clear that in the countries where democracy go down, and particularly because it's in so many places are driven by right-wing, extreme, reactionary nationalist parties that want to go back to some national ideal that never existed, of course. And that typically includes that women should go back home, cook food for the men, and bear many children. The greatest, and this is not only global north, this is global south as well, and different parts of the world. So it's a very clear correlation between this autocratization and decreasing space for women's rights and women's participation. And not coincidentally, the abortion issue comes up frequently, right? So.
Yes, quite naturally. Okay, I'm a bit conscious of the time here, so I would like to turn to our third theme, which is to look into the future and ask ourselves how these developments bode for the governance of the global challenges. And now, as a starting point, I wanted to share this with you. I find it striking that as analysts, we're constantly catching up with the world, and as if our assessments of the situation very often turned out to be too conservative. There is an impression that we're gradually realizing the extent to which democratic institutions have been undermined. And of course, there's objective explanations for that. I mean, democratic backsliding or autocratization is a complex phenomenon that has been unfolding before our eyes in a piecemeal, gradual manner. And there is a suspicion that when assessing a complex and threatening phenomenon like this, we have a systematic bias towards erring on the side of caution and thereby underestimating the seriousness or the speed or the scope of the change. Has been shown, for instance, in the case of climate change, that when assessing the magnitude and effects of climate change, scientists tend to adopt such a minimizing bias. So I wanted to ask Alex about this, and in particular about the work that you are doing around the rule of law. To what extent do you think that we're understanding the magnitude of the deteriorations in the rule of law that are taking place? And do you think that there is indeed a risk that we underestimate these looking into the future?
That's a very good question, Reza. I think there are some metrics, and we'll produce some, Stefan. I mean, there's some global indicators that can show a trend of where we're going. As you pointed out, I think still the phenomenon is complex. I mean, we're able to, I think these indicators allow us to see a trend, a global trend, a regional trend, just in many cases, just trends over time, which are quite helpful, just to go beyond simply what we hear in the news. But still, I think it's a complex phenomenon. I mean, and the phenomenon manifests in very different ways in different countries. And that's why it just makes it difficult just on how that weakening happens. It happens in different ways in different countries, and usually depends, I would say, on three things. And we don't have, in many cases, a clear detail just of how it happens. But one is just obviously in the platforms and the actions of authoritarian leaders, what they do just whenever either they are coming to office or when they come to office, just either in speech or in actions, just that matters. Second is the context, the institutional context in which they do this, because it may impact, as I was saying, just it's different, just the same actions of a leader in a country that is already weakened, that the same actions just in a country that has relatively more robust institutions. Just so it's important to recognize the norms, the political context. In so many cases, they come with platforms in which they are able to change laws and norms very quickly. So that is important as well to recognize. And the third one, which is something that we don't talk as often, but is the opposition or the checks and balances that are in place that are pushing back those forces. And that can come from the political opposition to the checks and balances, the judiciaries, and so on. So it's a constant interplay that makes it difficult really to understand even at the country level what's happening and to measure it just on a consistent basis, just how much it's weakening. There are obviously some indications just when big jumps happen, but just it is this change that makes it a little bit more difficult. Probably I will think just what it's probably, I mean, when you ask the questions, we say, do we know, do we understand this? And probably a question as well. I mean, we may understand this, I mean, even with all these complexities, but it's important to ask, do people understand this? Because I think the analogy that you were making just on climate change and so on, it's equally important. I mean, just if people don't understand this, then don't really just act just based on those, on that information. And that I think is a challenge. I think that I don't know whether people fully understand this or fully care about this, as just linking it to what I was saying before, just that people may put just a lot of different things on the table, and care a lot about different things. So, and I think this is important. I mean, in part just because of the disinformation that we were talking about before, just the change in norms, just that people are suddenly normalizing all of this, and the fact that all of this takes time. I mean, it's not like what we used to have in the past, like these coup d'etats that from one day to another, even though we have recently, just 2 days ago, just the sudden change in Syria, but just all of these changes usually happen very gradually. So then it's very difficult for people just to notice, or they simply normalize it, and that is probably a more concerning, just because just they don't act on it. I mean, they just simply just see it as something just that happens, is the new norm, just, and they simply have to adapt. And I think that's probably equally worrisome.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. So from what I understand from what you say is that there is indeed a strong risk that both as citizens and as analysts, we don't fully grasp what is going on until it further deteriorates. Stefan, I wanted to connect the discussion about the future of governance with the many challenges that we see ahead of us in relation, in particular, to climate change that, so far we have totally failed to prepare for. COVID-19, I think, provided a dramatic illustration of how the way in which institutions are critical for our ability to respond to shocks, and conversely, how shocks affect our institutions. And we know that in the coming decades, we're going to have many more of these shocks with the growing challenges of migration flows, natural disasters, competition over scarce resources, from water to arable land, and so on. So considering these trends that we were discussing in recent years, what is our understanding, your understanding, the citizens' understanding of the way in which democratic institutions are going to respond to and evolve in this more adverse environment?
Thank you. Yeah, huge question in like 2 minutes.
Sorry.
I think no, yeah, but I think what at least what I've seen from the literature emerging in the aftermath of COVID is that on average, countries with strong democratic institutions actually did better rather than so in this, and that's another example of this debate where some have also in the climate change community argued, often the research is sponsored by China, that authoritarian governments are more capable and able to deal with challenges like this. In the best theoretical world, that could be it. One could make that argument and see the logic of that, right? But it also presumes that you have dictators or dictatorial parties and leaders or groups, whatever it is, at the helm who actually want to do something about this and want to prioritize it and want to do good for people, for its people. That's rarely the case historically. Like historically, dictatorships tend to be disastrous for people and for meeting challenges, whether it's Amartya Sen's famous observation about famine, that large-scale famine never happens in a democracy, and that's for a good reason. It happens in autocracies. And democracies have also been done better on the sort of Paris Climate Accord in terms of commitments and so on. And the differences are pretty huge. And of course there are, you can cherry pick one or two counter examples, but I'm talking about the general pattern. So I'm not sure how democracy will change or deal with these upcoming challenges, but I feel more and more certain that strong democratic institutions and norms, and preferably then inclusive, as Sarah has been pointing to, are important, critical means to deal with them in an effective way.
Yes, I think Sarah, you might want to also elaborate on this, and I will also leave it. I mean, this is probably the last question or so that we're taking, so I also leave it to you to give us a little bit of hope and tell us, how in this picture we can see at least paths through which things could improve, and where you see the potential for a deepening and resumption of the forces of democracy.
Thanks. And I would remind you of one of our previous Secretary General's statements that the UN was not created to take the world to heaven, but to save it from hell. So I will do what I can on hope. But actually, it's linked to the question that you asked, Stefan, as well, because and goes back to something I sort of referred to in one of my earlier interventions. I do think we need to be having a conversation about what democratic systems look like that are better at engaging in longer term issues and the rights of future generations as well. Our political systems in most places, as they are established, traditional liberal democracy systems are short term. They have short term incentives. And we need to find ways to find democratic and inclusive and participatory systems that enable long-term decision making for also including the rights of future generations. So I do see that there is hope, some hope, in some of the innovative deliberative mechanisms as they are being combined in hybrid ways with formal democratic systems as we see them. And I think it's that combination of the hybrid of the deliberative and the representational where I think there is some hope in tackling these future issues. And since I see that we're at time, I would also say that I think there is also hope in the fact that large numbers of people voted this year, and they may have voted for many reasons, and in some places their votes were bought and then coerced, and in some places they weren't, and in some places they were subject to huge amounts of misinformation and disinformation. But we still, in many more places, we have seen people take to the streets. Young people in particular, and we see people engaging in political activity and political engagement of all types, under all regime types. And so within people, there is a hunger for agency and participation and inclusion and in political systems. And so if there is hope, that's what I think drives me, it drives my colleagues. We're not naive about electoral elections, to wrap things up a little bit, but we do actually want to support people to exercise their rights and have agency in the societies in which they live. So I think that's where the hope lies.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. I mean, it's been a wonderful discussion. We talked about this year's outcomes. We talked about the shift in norms and the closing of the civic space and things that are not really going in the right direction across the good and bad news and the good and bad and the ugly. That there is definitely a confirmation of democratic backsliding or autocratization, but also that it takes more than elections, that we've been experiencing a rollback of gender equality. And there are risks that we might even underestimate this situation, and very probably it is going to get worse before it gets better. But we also talked about inclusion and agency as foundations for political legitimacy and the need and the possibility for a deepening of democratic institutions and the broadening of their scope and their time horizons. I think that was a very good point. So I want to thank you all for this very interesting and stimulative discussion. Of course, there's many more questions regarding the future of our institutions and governance, not least in relation to the kind of geopolitical tumble dryer in which we seem to be caught. That might be the theme for a future webinar, so continue to follow us and get some news. And for now, my renewed thanks to the panelists and to everyone who participated in today's webinar, and see you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.